All right, welcome to Witchpolice Radio. I'm on the internet. I'm actually in my pantry again today, which is kind of my secondary location to record podcasts. Usually, I'm either in my little office area where I do most of these, or if that computer is being used, I kind of cram myself into the pantry, and I'm surrounded by all these boxes of cereal and craisins and shit like that. And it somehow tends to sound pretty decent. So, the guest on the episode today is someone who has been on the show before in like a few different contexts over the years, but you haven't been on in a while, and we're kind of here today to talk about a new project you have coming out soon. So I think that the best way to sort of start this off is if you want to just introduce yourself and maybe give a bit of background about what it is that you do musically for people who don't know you.
Sure. I go by Bazooka Joe 204 presently. For years and years, I performed and recorded under the name John Smith. I'm a rapper originally from Churchill, Manitoba, way up north. Came down to Winnipeg in the mid 90s, started putting records out and playing shows in the late 90s. And here we are 20 years later. And I believe my eighth solo album is about to come out.
Very
It's
cool.
called Prairie Nilsson,
Which is a great name. As soon as I saw that on the line, I thought it was fantastic. But I guess like what I want to start with is you're most associated with a lot of people, for myself included, as being part of the whole Peanuts and Corn group there. And I mean, that's where some of most of your, I guess you would call them the classic albums you put out throughout your career as a rapper are on that label. And you've obviously put a lot of shows, appeared on records by all the other artists on there. And now you're back doing more again with Peanuts and Corn, which is great to see. But do you feel like there's been kind of a renaissance of that stuff in recent past couple of years with McEnroe kind of reminiscing on podcasts and all of you guys showing up on sort of I don't want to say nostalgic, but almost it is. It almost seems like that now 20 years or so after kind of the heyday of that, people are coming back around to it and appreciating it maybe in a different way than they did at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rod McEnroe has done the direct work to kind of let people know where we're at and that new releases are coming out again. Of course, he never stopped.
Right.
So I mean, I do think it's that. I definitely think COVID has something to do with it. I find myself going back to a lot of the old music that I listened to. A lot of things that used to be guilty pleasures are no longer guilty. Like you hit 40 and it's like I like what I like. You know what I mean? So I'm like, I'm riding my bike around, 25K around the city, listening to like the Prodigy and like the Hackers soundtrack and shit like that. And so, I think to some people we're that, right? Like we're a part of their adolescence or a part of their university days. And I just think maybe culturally there's more of an eye towards the past or what we might perceive to be the good old days or a more innocent time. And it just so happens we got a bunch of music coming out, so that I think there's some sort of a symbiotic relationship there.
Yeah, well, it's cool to see too, because I know people who weren't necessarily around at the time, whether they were too young or they were into different stuff, who have now sort of started, building up collections of all that stuff that you guys were doing in the early mid 2000s. It's very cool to see people appreciating it, often for the first time, and especially because things have changed so much musically, locally and otherwise, right? That it's almost like this sound from a former era that still has relevance to a lot of people who maybe didn't realize it was there in the first place.
Yeah, and I was even I do most of my kind of musing on Twitter.
Yeah.
And just even the other day on Twitter, I was talking about how it seems like there was a period where what people typically refer to as the golden era in hip hop, there's an eye kind of looking back towards it. It
Yeah.
feels like younger people are making sample based rap music, which like kind of fits a theory that I have about rap, which is people latch onto a sound, someone becomes really big and becomes the creative driving force for a period of time, and just so collectively a sound gets pursued, kind of, right?
Okay.
Um, and just, in recent years, hearing stuff that kind of harkens back to sample based rap. Right now, I'm hearing a lot of like kind of like upright bass, acoustic upright bass samples, which like
Yeah,
brings
that
me
jazz kind
back.
of vibe. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, brings me back to like Del the Funky Homo Sapiens second album, or Digable Planets, things like that. So yeah, it it feels like there's an appreciation for that era, and people are cool going back to it, and it's great because especially the latter part of the 90s, a lot of that sound kind of slipped through the cracks or was dismissed as novelty kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, and now people have access to all of it, right? Because of the way
Yeah.
that music consumption has changed, you can literally go into a pocket of that kind of stuff and sit there for years and just listen, like absorb everything that ever came out in those little subgenres for sure.
Yeah,
So,
there's not a lot of, you don't have to commit to anything.
yeah,
You can just
yeah.
check it out, right?
Yeah, I imagine that at this point too, the fact that you guys are all still making music in some capacity or another, there's got to be less pressure now to be putting out a record now than there may have been maybe at the height of the Peanuts and Corn thing, because I imagine it's more you're doing it for you than you were doing it for any kind of success as a because, well, first of all, COVID's ruined any chance of anyone playing shows, but I don't think any of you are playing shows to the same level you were back
No,
then.
no.
And so there's got to be a freeing a little bit to be able to make a record and just be able to do whatever you want on it.
Yeah, there's things have definitely changed. If you there's one of the singles that just came out, that I knew what for,
Yeah,
is kind of a summation of that feeling where it's like, you know, on our small scale, there was a period of time in the 2000 aughts where it kind of felt like, oh, maybe there's something here, maybe this can become a really sustainable thing, and
yeah,
a way to make our livings forever moving forward. So there was kind of a feeling of like going for the brass ring, so to speak. And the music I was making was definitely me taking a couple steps towards the mainstream. And yeah, it is low stakes now. You know what I mean? Like I, up until very recently, I was resigned to the fact that there's a few. The way I was kind of expressing it was there's a few dozen really loyal people who will listen to every project, but you know th- that kind of reaching for the brass ring mentality fell by the wayside a long time ago. And musically, there's none of that. We grew up with a really, hip hop a lot like punk or hardcore or metal
yeah,
even. There was like some really stringent rules, like there was a lot of, you know, what I would describe as kind of conservative, kind of rigid ideology. And that stuff has kind of fallen by the wayside too, right?
yeah,
So at this point it's like, steal an instrumental, jump on it, rap on it, release it for free, put it out there, like uh and like working with McEnroe in particular, like the music that he makes, the best thing about it is in every sense of the word timeless. You know what
yeah,
I mean? Like
yeah,
like I don't feel like you hear a McEnroe produced song in 2021 and say, "Hey, this sounds like PNC back in 2001." You know what I
yeah, yeah.
mean? Like he just occupies this space that's kind of outside of time, and so yeah, just working with him kind of already is putting yourself in a spot where it's like, okay, we're not really too concerned with fitting into any box, being the avatar of anything, any movement, any of that stuff, right? Like
Yeah.
all of those kind of illusions have fallen by the wayside. So
Well, and you've worked with McEnroe since the very beginning, right? I mean, you have a very long history of working with him. What do you think it is about the two of you that meshes so well? And I know you just kind of described the timelessness of his sound and why it works, for listeners kind of across eras. But what is about the combination of the two of you and maybe the other Peanuts and Corn members as well, always on each other's albums and things like that? What makes that unit of people mesh so well together? Because there's so many styles among that
yeah,
group.
I mean, me, the last few records, I've been really I haven't been inviting a lot of guests on, even within the crew.
Yeah.
And that's not like, that's a byproduct of like not being young and kicking it together all the time, like, so yeah, it becomes, for me, it's become more of a solitary pursuit. And what Rod does is he gives me more options as far
Okay.
as like, especially with the drums that he gives you, because he is doing some really advanced shit. There's always a little bit extra to it. It's not that kind of chunky
Yeah.
stunted stuff from the late 90s, early 2000. And I really can get down with that. Even in my other projects, I when I made an album with Cut Down, for instance, he was always remarking upon me taking beats that no one else was fucking with. And it's just because I'm looking for something a little different, like I'm never looking to I'm never hearing something and being like, oh, this sounds like this really popular thing, and I
Right.
think I can kind of do something that's like that, for it. That's not the way that the beats kind of speak to me, I guess, is what I would say.
Okay. Is there something particular you're looking for? Like, how do you know when a beat is going to work for you? Do you have to sit with it for a while and sort of experiment with it?
It's pretty quick. Like, there's so many different ways to make stuff now, but one of the things that a lot of people in rap do is kind of like live in the studio,
Yeah.
like, and that's never really been the way. We've always like had limited pockets of time to work in. So it's like it's like, you had to show up ready to rap and know your stuff, right?
Right. Right.
um and so you would sit with them before you went in, so for me, the process is usually I'll ask a producer for a pack of beats, but as soon as I play them, I know almost immediately if something is going to work for me or not, right?
Okay.
So usually first or second pass through on the beats, just listening to snippets, I can feel emotion, like there's got to be some intrigue there, like, do I want to get in there
For sure.
and check it out, see if it feels right. And then yeah, and then the other thing is drums, like where do these drums put me as far as like flowing goes, can I catch a little bit of an idea based on the way these drums are hitting me, and
Okay.
and
Okay.
then and then it's just go from there,
Cool. So on this new record that's coming out, when is it coming out? First of all, that's probably a good question to ask there.
October 15th. It's a Friday, I believe. And yeah, the album's called Prairie Nilsson.
Cool. On this album, how have you changed? I guess as a rapper, is there a noticeable difference kind of over the progression of your records up to this point, or do you still sound like the same you that everyone has familiarized themselves with over the past couple decades?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'd like to think I keep honing the craft, getting better and better. That's the goal.
Yeah, of course, yeah,
That's a big part of it for me. Like, you know people kind of talk about art as it's this thing that just spills out of you, and it does. The emotion is there, and it's pushing all the time. But it's also like, hey, I've nurtured this thing for a really long time and worked really hard at it, and hopefully I get better and better at this thing. And so on this record, the hope is that it's still me. It's still very obviously me.
yeah,
And yeah, with just a little bit, things are a little bit tighter, I think. There's some updated stuff in there. Like I try to keep as up to date on the new shit as possible, because you
yeah,
don't want to be replicating stuff without knowing it, right? Like, that was something that used to happen in rap all the time. Was some of the legends, especially some of the kind of like the older New York dudes, would just like present you with a song, like maybe a high concept song,
hmm,
and it's like everyone who's paying attention hears that, recognizes it, and says, wow, that's a lot like this other song, that
sure,
came out a year ago or 6 months ago or whatever. So you know I pay attention to the new rappers for inspiration, and so because you don't want to duplicate things. And yeah, there's definitely like some songs with flows on them where it's like, oh, like I was listening to a lot of, Maxo Cream when I wrote this song, or something like that. So I mean, there's that, but I always take stuff and kind of make it my own, like I remember way back when I was making records with Pip, I would come to him and I would be like, I listened to a lot of Tim Dog lately, so here's like my Tim Dog. And of course it wouldn't sound anything like Tim Dog because it's
Right.
always a little, or mostly me. So, the things that I'm taking are, cadences and flows and things of that nature, but just because they're filtered through a 42-year-old white guy from Winnipeg, they're gonna be
Yeah.
different.
Well, and that 42 white guy from Winnipeg vibe too is, I think, something that appeals to a lot of people about your music and about the whole Penis and Corn crew in general, is that it sounds very much like no one's attempting to sound like what they're not. I mean, whether the Tim Dog cadence or something's coming through there, you're not actively trying to sound like Tim Dog, or you're not trying to sound like anyone else. And I think
No, exactly.
that's why it lasts. I think, right? The beats, obviously, McEnroe's beats are, like you said, timeless, but I think there's that kind of genuineness to all of it that comes through and still does.
Yeah, that's baked into it, like when I first kind of was brought into the fold by the older PNC guys, McEnroe, Honeycutt, Pip Skid.
Yeah.
The very first note I got, and it was the most important one, was, "You're not from New York. Stop pretending to be more experienced than you are."
Yeah.
Like, because I was talking all the shit before I did any of the stuff, and that might work on some, like, live, love, live, laugh, eat, pray shit, like kind of manifesting
Yeah.
shit. But in that era in rap, you had to be about the shit that you were talking about on the records. So
Yeah. Otherwise, people see through it pretty quick and pass it off as, this is not legit.
yeah, well, and especially in that era, like, like, especially as a white person, you were number one, a visitor. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? You're
Yeah.
you're a guest in that space, in the space of hip hop music, period, then and now. So yeah, you want to be respectful, and it was street music, and sometimes you were putting yourself in a dangerous spot, but if you wanted to be about this thing, you had to be about it, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term. So
Yeah. Has that attitude changed at all over the years? Now that, I mean, hip hop definitely still is. It's not white people culture, but it's been so globalized, and it's just so many offshoots and subgenres that are, and ways of incorporating hip hop into pop music that was always there, but in so many other styles. Like, is it a bit? Does that kind of genuineness, is it less important now, do you think, for hip hop?
yeah, I mean, I think the difference is the lack of community, right? Like that, or the maybe not the lack of community, because they're finding community in different places, right? They're
Right.
finding community online with like-minded individuals elsewhere, as opposed to, hey, I need to go and stick my feet in the fire here where I'm
Right.
from, and see, you know, you nowadays it kind of gets described as gatekeeping, and there's a negative connotation to it. But when there was a hierarchy to things, uh it made, there was kind of tests put in place to ensure that people weren't necessarily manipulating this thing to their own ends.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have a new song with Rob Crooks about this, called "When the White Boy," and it's all about, it's about appropriation. And in our era, there's no doubt, that white kids from Manitoba making rap music is appropriation.
Sure. Sure.
um and the difference is we were a part of a community with all sorts of different ethnicities,
Yeah.
and people from all around the world, and that was just like, that was the way that it worked. And so yeah, so what, there's a lot of shit now with people appropriating, especially slang and things of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah.
And they get it because they see other people use it on Twitter, or there's a there's kind of digital blackface is another thing where, a person's whole online existence is like gifs of Nene Leakes and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and RuPaul's show. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, like I think there's a little bit more of a danger of rap being accepted as universal and everybody's,
Yeah.
and a separation of where it came from, and definitely like a big part of uh I want to say membership, but that's not the word for it, but more people making the music and claiming to be part of it, who don't necessarily know the history behind it,
Yeah.
and know where it comes from and what it was about and what it should be about, I guess is another way to say it.
Do you feel like there's pressure on someone like you who's been involved, since that era, to sort of make sure people know that and make sure younger people that you encounter who are, either interested in hip hop or trying to do it themselves, kind of make that connection? Because it's so easy to not now, because everything is so disposable. The way the internet has kind of changed music consumption and that history. I mean, some people, yeah, they're definitely doing their research, but a lot of people, it's just kind of everything's on shuffle, and it's all just kind of lost in a big mess of content, right?
Well, yeah, and as a white rapper, you don't want to see it go the way of rock and roll, where it's
Yeah,
like rock and roll was black music, and remains black music. But if you were to look at it in the era that I grew up in, in the 80s,
yeah,
it was presented on a mainstream level as a very white thing. And it
totally.
was so divorced from that kids in current generations don't know that. And you can kind of, I think it's harder to separate with rap because they didn't separate black artists from the music like they did with rock and roll.
That's right. Yeah, yeah,
The industry, the powers that be. So, it's intractable in that way, but I do think there's a lot of kids who believe they should have full access to this thing, and all the perks of it, all the style,
yeah,
like all the hip, all the shit you get points for, and none of the dedication or the risk or all that shit that was inherent in it
yeah,
before,
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's it's interesting. It's interesting how culture has changed too. Like not hip hop culture, but just our culture in general towards kind of like on one hand more acknowledgement of that stuff, which is great, and acknowledgement of cultural appropriation and where things come from. And but then on the other hand, there's like less of it. It seems like depending on who you're talking to, there's either a very concerted effort to make sure that's known, or just everything is everything and I don't care.
Yeah, there's trade-offs there, right? Like there's obviously way more black millionaires, and like there's a lot more people providing for their family for real, as
Yeah,
opposed to, when you look at the 90s, a lot of those dudes were left, penniless and re-entering the workplace, in a different capacity. So, there's more success in that way, right? The money is there, and that's
sure.
great, but by the same token, the stuff that breaks through to the mainstream and gets attention feels increasingly, based in places that are more about aesthetic, let's say, than content,
100%.
and that's no knock to the artist. There shouldn't be certainly a white guy. I'm not going to tell, Future that he needs to be more conscious in his shit, or,
Yeah, of course.
Lil
Yeah,
Uzi Vert or someone like that. Like, that's not my place. But it does seem that there's less space in the mainstream for some of the stuff that did break through back in the day. Public Enemy,
yeah,
Tribe Called Quest, the Afrocentric, all that Afrocentric shit from the early 90s.
for sure.
So yeah, so I mean, it's pros and cons, right? It's you got a little bit more of this, but now there's this,
Yeah,
like, and it's kind of, I talk about Snoop Dogg kind of becoming almost like Betty White. You know
for
what I
sure.
mean?
Yeah, he's doing stuff with Martha
Like
Stewart, and he's got always on
yeah,
TV saying funny stuff. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and that's something that couldn't happen before.
No,
Like um, it shows you how deeply a part of mainstream culture rap has become. It essentially, just like sampling, consumed everything that came before it, and
yeah,
now it is a part of the whole thing. Um, but yeah, I long for, and I go looking for it. I go for rap that speaks to different experiences, like different perspectives, and basically like intriguing personalities is
Yeah.
what I'm looking for nowadays, like, is there a different perspective here? Is someone doing something really out there technically? Or is somebody, bringing attention to issues that need to be brought attention to? Those are all things that I'm looking for
Yeah.
nowadays.
Well, I don't want to talk too much on this either, but part of the reason I've been thinking about this is because in the 90s, I was in a ska band, right? And ska is an inherently political Jamaican form of music. And people, it's having a bit of a revival now, which is weird and unexpected, but kind of cool. And people are thinking the way it's being revived is through that lens of like dorky white guys wearing ties and Hawaiian shirts and like spinny shit on their head or whatever. And it's almost like it's unfortunate that this is how it's being brought back into the culture instead of going back to the actual Jamaican roots of it, which is first of all better music, and secondly
Yeah.
like has all of the struggle behind it and everything that really made it powerful in the first place. So yeah, I can see hip hop having similar struggles in the 21st century too.
Yeah, a lot, it's defanged, you know what
Yeah,
I mean?
yeah,
And that's unfortunate, especially if you come, the background of very specifically myself and my crew is a real DIY kind of punk
yeah, yeah,
thing, and that's always been to me an honorific, you know what I mean? Like, um, and yeah, it's it's a little frustrating to, because I want defiance, you know what I mean? And I make music with that built into it,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm looking for it, um, which is why, that's how you end up kind of like, oh, I used to be really into conscious rap, and then eventually arriving at a place where it's like, I'm just listening to the hardest, most underground gangster shit
Yep.
that I can find because I'm looking for the experience of like hard charging aggression,
Yep.
and this is where I'm finding it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. As a listener, I went through that with dancehall too, because I've been listening to dancehall my whole life, and it was started getting just. I got sick of all the pop leadings it was taking. Now I'm finding all these weird guys from like Grenada and stuff who are talking about slicing people up with machetes, and it's like the hardest shit I've ever heard in my life, and it's awesome, and it's like it's so far from the mainstream, but did something appeals to about it because it's so much. It's like it's fresh again because they're saying something just so extreme that was kind of what drew a lot of people to it in the 90s. Same deal with hip hop, right? I mean, you're saying something that is totally so far to your experience as a white 40-year-old in Winnipeg, and it's like, wow, this is crazy. And then things got kind of smoothed over and pop and genericized, and yeah. But
Yeah, it's
yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was going to switch topics, but if you have something to say on that, please do.
Well, I was just gonna say, you and I both, we like to talk about Peter Tosh, and
Yeah,
like, and Peter Tosh used to often talk about like how many love songs can we write? You know what I mean? Like how many love songs do we need? And in hip hop, I would never be one of those people who's like, like it's such a celebration of excess and blah
yeah,
blah 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 blah. Like a lot of it is, and a lot of the stuff that succeeds in the mainstream is. But once in a while, it would be good if like all the anthems weren't written by the winners. Like
totally, totally.
like I want to hear anthems from the losers. Like you always hear from like the hustler who's kind of on top. It's like I want to hear from like the hand to hand people on the street, and I want to hear from people like struggling with addiction, and like
Yeah,
that's the kind of voices I'd like to search out.
for sure. One of the things that we said a few minutes ago too about the kind of punk rock nature of what you do and what the whole PNC crew has done as well. I think I may have said this to you before. I know I've said it every time I have anyone from that group of people on the show, but that's what drew me to your stuff in the first place was the DIY angle, because I was coming from punk rock and reggae and hardcore and stuff, and that appealed. And I think that you're still doing that, which is cool to see that, regardless of how things have changed for the popularity or whatever of what you're doing, that DIY element is still there all these years later, which is really cool to see, because I think a lot of people, they find a way to either give up if the DIY thing's not working or just move past it and whatever, but you guys are still in it, which is very cool.
Yeah, and that's something that the song Art School Kids, which is another one of the
Yeah,
new singles, like is directly about. It's about me looking around at, who got to, because it's a privilege, it's a privilege to put your adult life's work into music,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
not a lot of people don't get to do that, and especially poor people don't get to do that, and so art school kids is me looking around and taking stock of who survived in music, and it's not people like myself, like
Not usually, no.
uh and so yeah, it's for me it was always music, and I dropped out of high school. I've had to support myself
Yeah,
in not necessarily legal ways. Things have been sketchy. There's been a lot of extended stays on couches, all throughout this. And um and yeah, for other people, music is like, hey, I was in a band when I was in university,
totally.
and you know and you know I there's also a part of me that looks at the way things are structured in music in Canada, and it's like I think there's a lot of infrastructure there for bands to survive, and rappers don't get access to that stuff a lot of the time, like, and granted, a lot of stuff is about fitting,
Sure.
and but there's, as a band, you got a lot more access to festivals and summer touring and things of that nature than rappers,
Yeah.
if you get a band together and like a turntablist, like you might be able to do some summer festival runs and stuff. But yeah, there's not a lot of infrastructure there, for the rappers, and definitely for, as you get older, it's almost like you're expected to age out of it.
Yeah, yeah.
um but yeah, it's I got into this and I put all my chips in there. Other people look at music like this is a thing that I'm gonna pick up and play around with for a few years and then put down, and then I'm gonna
Yeah.
go do the real adult thing, so yeah, it's something that I think about and I examine.
With all that in mind, what is it like then to release an album now for you? I mean, COVID and the way that's impacted any kind of live performances and stuff aside, like what does it look like for you now releasing an album next month, or by the time people hear this, maybe it is the month, um, and having to sort of get it out there to the world now? Is it is that a big part of it, or are you just happy to have the music released and kind of out there in the universe?
Yeah, well, I lost a few years, not dedicated to music. I kind of was swimming around in addiction and had some mental health challenges. Last couple of years I've kind of really changed that part of my life. Um Super, so I approach this humbly, is
Yeah,
what I'm saying. Um so playing live was something that for a long time was like very, very much a part of my life. And for the years even prior to COVID, there wasn't a lot going on, maybe a couple times a year.
yeah,
A lot of like my performing, shifted over to, where you could find me hanging out at, so it's like I'm kicking it with people guitars and rapping by campfires and
yeah,
things like that. But yeah, I mean that that part of me isn't, or hasn't been as active. Absolutely, in a perfect world, if this shit didn't happen, I would be, playing as many times as I could and looking for
yeah,
those opportunities. But like playing lives, it becomes harder now that I've kind of lost a lot of the hubris from when I was younger. Like back in the day, you never know what you were going to get. You could walk in and there'd be 200 people there, like knowing all the lyrics to everything and dying to see you. And then, the next spot on tour or the next local show, there might be six people,
yeah.
and your pay might be two OVs and a shot of Jägermeister,
Right.
um, so yeah, so that part of my life has shifted and changed so much that it's like I'm okay with this aspect of it. I'm looking to figure out some sort of a party. October 15th is a little iffy,
Yeah.
like it's, I did some research. I checked out the weather on every October 15th for the last 10 years. Because you don't want to plan to try to do anything indoors and then have,
Yeah, the
with
restrictions come back, and yeah,
things,
yeah,
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 and it's like at a bar, especially, there's things on the line, right? You got to
yep,
deposit, they're booking people to come in and work. So, there's a part of me that wants to do something outdoors. You know, I'm sussing it out right now.
Cool.
But yeah, I mean, what do you do? Like, you do an Instagram show, which, you know, I've never, you know, I don't know what kind of setup optimizes that as a venue, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
so yeah, it's a puzzle, man. Doing a lot of podcasts, or, you know, at least a handful. Um, we've got a company kind of pushing our stuff, you know, like, so we've got some publicity behind it.
Cool.
Um, but yeah, man, like, in a perfect world, I would be playing jams right now, you know?
Cool. Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
unfortunately, this is like as far from a perfect world as you can get, right? But
Yeah, exactly.
so I mean, the good thing about this being a podcast is, you know, whether someone hears it right when it comes out, or a year after, or 2 years later, or whatever, by the time they hear it, there's a very good chance that your record will be out, and you may even be moving on to more stuff or playing live or whatever. So, what's the best way to kind of keep up with what's going on in your world, and as far as releases and shows and things like that?
Yeah, best way to follow me is on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm much more active on Twitter than I am on Instagram.
Okay.
But in both cases, it's Bazooka Joe 204 on both Instagram and on Twitter.
Okay.
That's the best way. You know, if you're looking to listen or support us, then I would point you to the Peanuts and Corn Bandcamp. And you know, it's not just my stuff, it's
Yeah.
all of the posse's stuff. There's dozens and dozens of releases to check out. I will remind people that I put out a record with Rob Crooks called Schadenfreude
It's
on
a good
Beat 'em
record.
Up
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
couple years ago. That's going to be getting a physical re-release in a very limited way,
Cool.
with kind of some handcrafted packaging, and, you
Hmm.
know, the kind of stuff that makes you want to go out and buy a cassette tape in 2021.
Yeah. Yeah. For
But
sure. Yeah.
yeah, I've got another project with him in the works, and I'm super excited about, you know, the music we've made together and the music that's coming out. And then there's more PNC stuff coming. I'm working on a follow up to Pinky's Laundromat,
Oh wow.
from back in 2003, which is like a deep, high concept storytelling album.
Yeah.
So that'll be the next solo kind of release. And I'm working on a new Park Like Setting album as well,
Oh wow.
myself, McEnroe, and Yai. So yeah, you know, the first question you asked about, you know, is there a bit of a resurgence happening? Yeah, you know, like, if there's one positive that's come out of the pandemic, and it's horrible to say it that way now that I say it out loud, but
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you mean, though. Yeah, it is horrible to say
but
it, but it makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I think everybody's looking inward and has a lot of thoughts, and, you know, not necessarily, you know, we're not writing 20 concept songs about COVID either. You know
Of
what I
course. Yeah.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's a productive time for music because, you know, it has to be, I guess, would be the best way to say that.
Cool.